The waiting room at Atlanta General Hospital buzzed with its usual morning activity when the automatic doors slid open, letting in a gust of crisp autumn air along with a mother and her young daughter. The girl, just 12 years old, clutched her stomach, her face twisted in pain as her mother guided her gently to the registration desk. "My daughter needs to see a doctor immediately," the mother said, her voice calm but firm. As a pediatrician herself at Children's Memorial across town, Dr. Karen Lee knew the signs. Her daughter Min had been up all night with worsening abdominal pain, and her maternal and medical instincts were both screaming that this was serious. The nurse at the desk looked up sympathetically, taking in Min's pale face and hunched posture. She quickly processed their paperwork, noticing Dr. Lee's medical credentials. "The attending physician will be with you shortly," she assured them, moving Min's file to the urgent stack. Minutes felt like hours as they sat in the hard plastic chairs. Min leaned against her mother's shoulder, tears silently rolling down her cheeks. Dr. Lee stroked her daughter's hair, remembering all the times she treated children with similar symptoms in her own practice. Being on the other side of the situation, watching her own child suffer, was a special kind of torture. "It hurts more now, Mom," Min whispered, gripping her mother's hand tighter. Dr. Lee checked her daughter's forehead. She was burning up. Looking around the waiting room, she saw several other families waiting, but none of the children appeared to be in as much distress as Min. Finally, the attending physician appeared in the doorway. Dr. Lee recognized him immediately. Dr. Robert Chen, known throughout the Atlanta medical community for his decades of experience. But something felt off about his demeanor as he glanced at their folder. He barely looked at Min as he entered the room, his eyes fixed on the chart. "What brings you here today?" he asked, his tone dismissive, directing the question to his computer screen rather than to either of them. "My daughter has been experiencing severe abdominal pain since last night," Dr. Lee explained professionally. "It started around her navel and has moved to her lower right side. She's also developed a fever, and the pain has significantly increased in the last few hours." Dr. Chen finally looked up, but his expression changed subtly as his eyes moved between mother and daughter. His next words came out cold and clipped. "It's probably just a stomach bug going around. Kids get them all the time. Give her some over-the-counter pain medicine and clear fluids." Dr. Lee felt her professional composure slipping. "I'm a pediatrician at Children's Memorial," she stated firmly. "These symptoms strongly suggest appendicitis. She needs immediate blood work and an ultrasound to rule out. I don't need another doctor telling me how to do my job." Dr. Chen cut her off sharply. "If you're so sure about the diagnosis, perhaps you should take her to your own hospital." The tension in the room became palpable. A young nurse standing nearby looked uncomfortable, shifting her weight from foot to foot as she witnessed the exchange. Min whimpered softly, squeezing her mother's hand tighter, while Dr. Lee struggled to maintain her composure in the face of such blatant unprofessionalism. Little did any of them know that this morning would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would change not just their lives, but the entire culture of Atlanta General Hospital. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most painful experiences, and this story was about to become one that would be told for years to come. The tension in the examination room grew heavier as Dr. Chen turned his back, already reaching for the door handle. Dr. Lee stood up, her voice shaking slightly but determined. "My daughter is clearly in severe pain. As a fellow medical professional, I'm requesting basic tests to rule out appendicitis." But Dr. Chen had already stepped halfway out of the room. "The waiting room is full of actual emergencies," he said over his shoulder. "Give her some ginger ale and crackers. She'll be fine." The door clicked shut behind him, leaving behind a stunned silence. The young nurse who had witnessed everything lingered, her eyes full of concern. Her name tag read Amy. She glanced at the door where Dr. Chen had exited, then back at Min and her mother. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, genuine distress in her voice. "This isn't right." Min doubled over suddenly, a fresh wave of pain hitting her. "Mom," she gasped, her face growing even paler. Dr. Lee's heart raced as she watched her daughter's condition deteriorating before her eyes. As both a mother and a doctor, she felt helpless, a feeling she had never experienced in either role before. "I need to speak with the department head," Dr. Lee announced, her voice steady despite her rising anger. She had spent years building professional relationships in Atlanta's medical community, and she knew this wasn't how things were supposed to work. "Please get me whoever's in charge." Amy nodded quickly. "Dr. Thompson is the department head, but she's in surgery right now." She hesitated, then added in a lower voice, "But Dr. Wu is the attending physician on the next shift. He'll be here in 20 minutes. Those 20 minutes felt like an eternity. Dr. Lee sat beside Min, monitoring her temperature and pulse, growing increasingly worried as her daughter's fever climbed. Other patients and families in nearby rooms watched curiously as various hospital staff members walked past their door, some glancing in with concerned expressions. A young resident stopped by, offering water and attempting to help, but admitted she couldn't order tests without Dr. Chen's approval. The system that Dr. Lee had worked within her entire career now felt like it was working against her, bound by hierarchies and protocols that suddenly seemed ridiculous in the face of a suffering child. Through the thin walls, they could hear Dr. Chen's voice in the next room, speaking cheerfully to another patient. The contrast in his demeanor was stark and obvious. Dr. Lee felt her blood boiling, but she forced herself to remain calm for Min's sake. Her daughter had never seen her mother this upset, and even through her pain, Min tried to be brave. "Mom, maybe we should go to your hospital," Min suggested weakly, trying to sit up. But Dr. Lee knew moving her daughter now could be dangerous if it really was appendicitis. Every minute counted, and they had already lost precious time. Just then, commotion erupted in the hallway. Emergency personnel burst through the doors, rushing a stretcher down the corridor. Dr. Lee caught snippets of conversation. There had been a serious car accident. She heard Dr. Chen's voice rise above the chaos, suddenly urgent and concerned. "That's my daughter." His voice cracked with panic. "Someone get the best surgeon available." The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone who had witnessed his earlier behavior. Amy, the nurse, stood in the doorway of Min's room, her eyes wide as she watched the scene unfold. She turned to Dr. Lee with a meaningful look. Sometimes life had its own way of teaching important lessons. Nobody knew it yet, but this moment would mark a turning point in their morning, one that would force everyone involved to confront their own biases and assumptions. The next few minutes would change everything, not just for Min and her mother, but for Dr. Chen and the entire hospital. The emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as medical staff rushed to attend to Dr. Chen's daughter. Through the open door of their exam room, Dr. Lee and Min watched as Dr. Chen paced frantically, his earlier arrogance replaced by raw fear. His daughter lay unconscious on the stretcher, her face pale beneath the oxygen mask. Amy, the kind-hearted nurse, hurried into Min's room. "Dr. Lee," she whispered urgently, "Min's looking worse. Her fever's probably climbing." She glanced at Min, who was now curled into a tight ball, her face covered in sweat. The young girl's pain had become so intense she could barely speak. Dr. Lee felt her daughter's forehead. It was burning hot. Years of medical experience told her they were running out of time. "We need help now," she said firmly. "Find me another doctor, anyone who can authorize these tests." Just then, they heard Dr. Chen's panicked voice in the hallway. "Where is Dr. Wu?" They said he was on his way. The same doctor he had dismissed as unnecessary for Min was now the one he desperately needed for his own daughter. As if on cue, the emergency room doors opened, and Dr. Wu walked in, still pulling on his white coat. He took in the scene quickly. Dr. Chen's daughter on one side, and through the open door, he spotted Min's deteriorating condition. Unlike Dr. Chen, he saw both girls as children in need. Nothing more, nothing less. "We have 2 critical cases," Dr. Wu announced calmly. "I'll need teams for both." He turned to Dr. Chen, who stood frozen in shock. "Your daughter is in good hands with the trauma team." Right now, I'm going to check on the patient you dismissed earlier. Dr. Chen's face flushed with shame as Dr. Wu walked purposefully into Min's room. The contrast between the two doctors was striking. Where Dr. Chen had barely glanced at Min, Dr. Wu immediately knelt to her eye level, speaking gently as he began his examination. "How long has the pain been this severe?" Dr. Wu asked, his hands expertly pressing on Min's abdomen. When she winced sharply at a specific spot, his expression grew serious. "Get me an ultrasound machine in here now," he ordered, "and start her on IV fluids immediately." The room sprang to life with activity. Amy efficiently set up the IV, while another nurse wheeled in the ultrasound equipment. Dr. Li held Min's hand, relief washing over her as she finally watched her daughter receiving proper medical care. Through the window, she could see Dr. Chen watching, his own fear for his daughter evident on his face. "Classic appendicitis presentation," Dr. Wu confirmed after checking the ultrasound. "It's advanced. We need to get her into surgery immediately." He turned to Dr. Li, speaking both as a colleague and to a worried mother. "We caught it in time, but barely. A few more hours of delay could have been catastrophic." As they prepared to move Min to surgery, Dr. Chen approached the room hesitantly. The proud, dismissive doctor from earlier was gone, replaced by a humbled man who had just experienced every parent's nightmare. Twice. Once through his own actions, and once through his own child's emergency. "I'm sorry," he said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. I made a terrible mistake. Please, let me help." The words seemed to cost him greatly, but they were sincere. Dr. Wu looked at him steadily. "You can help by making sure this never happens again. Not to any child, not for any reason." The message was clear. This wasn't just about one incident, but about changing deep-rooted behaviors that had no place in medicine. As Min was wheeled toward surgery, Dr. Li caught a glimpse of Dr. Chen's daughter being treated in the next room. Two girls, two fathers, two very different approaches to care. But perhaps, through this shared experience, an opportunity for real change was emerging. The surgical floor waiting room was eerily quiet compared to the chaos of the emergency room below. Dr. Li sat with her hands clasped, watching the minutes tick by on the wall clock. Somewhere behind those operating room doors, her daughter was fighting for her life. A few seats away, Dr. Chen sat in a similar pose, waiting for news about his own daughter. Amy, the nurse who had advocated for Min earlier, had come upstairs on her break to sit with Dr. Li. "Dr. Wu is the best surgeon we have," she said softly, trying to offer comfort. "Both girls are in good hands." The elevator doors opened, and Dr. Wu emerged, still in his surgical scrubs. Both parents stood up instantly, their previous conflict forgotten in the face of shared parental anxiety. Dr. Wu's face gave nothing away as he approached them. "Your daughter's surgery went perfectly," he said to Dr. Li first, his kind eyes crinkling with a smile. "We removed the appendix just in time. Another hour of delay could have been disastrous, but she's going to make a full recovery." The relief that flooded through Dr. Li was overwhelming. She caught herself on the arm of the chair, tears flowing freely now. Amy squeezed her shoulder in support, her own eyes glistening. Dr. Wu then turned to Dr. Chen, whose face had grown increasingly pale during the wait. "Your daughter's surgery was more complicated due to the accident injuries, but she's stable now. We've repaired the internal bleeding, and while recovery will take time, she's going to be okay." Dr. Chen collapsed back into his chair, his professional facade crumbling completely. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I don't deserve, after what I did." He looked up at Dr. Li, years of ingrained prejudice washing away in a flood of shame and gratitude. "Both girls are being moved to recovery," Dr. Wu continued. "They'll be in rooms right next to each other. I think there's a lesson in that somewhere." His gentle words carried weight that everyone in the room felt. As they waited to see their daughters, Dr. Chen approached Dr. Li slowly. "I've been a doctor for 25 years, he said, his voice quiet but clear. Today made me realize I've been failing my oath all this time. Not just with your daughter, with how many others. How many times did I let my biases affect my judgment? Dr. Lee listened silently, seeing the genuine pain and regret in his eyes. 20 minutes ago, she might have been too angry to hear his words, but something about shared fear and shared relief had created a space for understanding. Change starts with awareness, she finally replied. What matters now is what you do going forward. Amy, who had witnessed everything from the beginning, spoke up unexpectedly. We could use this experience to make real changes in the hospital. Create new protocols, mandatory training. Her voice trailed off as both doctors turned to look at her. Dr. Chen nodded slowly. Yes, we could. We should. He straightened up, some of his old confidence returning, but tempered now with humility. Dr. Lee, would you be willing to help? To share your experience? We need voices like yours to make sure this never happens again. Before she could answer, a nurse appeared to tell them they could see their daughters. As they walked together toward the recovery rooms, Dr. Lee realized that sometimes the worst moments could lead to the most important changes. What had started as a morning of discrimination and fear was transforming into an opportunity for genuine transformation. Through the recovery room windows, they could see both girls resting peacefully, their beds separated only by a thin curtain. In that moment, the arbitrary barriers that had seemed so important to some just hours ago looked exactly as meaningless as they truly were. The next morning, sunlight streamed through the hospital room windows, casting a warm glow over the recovery ward. Min was sitting up in bed, already asking for her favorite books, while Dr. Lee dozed in the chair beside her. In the next room, Dr. Chen's daughter was also showing signs of improvement, her vital signs growing stronger by the hour. The night shift was just ending when Dr. Chen appeared in Min's doorway, holding 2 paper cups of steaming coffee. He cleared his throat softly, and Dr. Lee opened her eyes. Without a word, he offered her one of the cups, a small gesture, but one that spoke volumes. I spent all night thinking, he said, pulling up a chair. About yesterday, about my whole career really. He paused, watching Min flip through a magazine Amy had brought her. I talked to my daughter this morning, told her what happened, what I did. She was ashamed of me. Dr. Lee sipped her coffee, listening. The anger from yesterday had faded, replaced by a cautious hope that something good might come from all this. What did you tell her? The truth. That I let prejudice cloud my judgment as a doctor. That I nearly caused serious harm because of my own bias. His voice cracked slightly. She asked me what I was going to do to make it right. Smart kid. She's always been better than me that way. Just then, Amy came in for her morning rounds, her face brightening at seeing both doctors talking. Good morning. How are our patients doing? She checked Min's vital signs, then glanced at Dr. Chen. The hospital board is meeting this afternoon. I heard they want to discuss what happened yesterday. Dr. Chen straightened in his chair. Yes, I called the meeting myself. I'm going to report my own conduct. He turned to Dr. Lee. Would you be willing to attend? To share your experience? I understand if you'd rather not, but your voice could help make real changes here. Before Dr. Lee could respond, they heard voices in the hallway. Dr. Wu was doing his morning rounds, accompanied by several medical students. He stopped at the doorway, taking in the scene before him. Perfect timing, he said. I was just explaining to our students about the critical importance of unbiased emergency care. Perhaps. He looked questioningly at both doctors. You'd be willing to share your perspectives. Min spoke up from her bed, surprising everyone. Mom, you should tell them. Maybe it'll help other kids. Her simple words carried a wisdom that touched everyone in the room. Dr. Lee looked around at the eager faces of the medical students, then at Dr. Chen's hopeful expression, and finally at her daughter's encouraging smile. This was how change happened. One conversation, one lesson, one mind at a time. Yes, she said finally. I'll speak at the board meeting. But I don't want to just talk about what went wrong. I want to discuss how we can make things better." She turned to Dr. Chen. "You said your daughter asked what you're going to do to make it right. Well, what if we created a new training program? Something mandatory for all staff?" Dr. Chen nodded eagerly. "Yes, and protocols for checking our biases in emergency situations. Regular reviews of treatment decisions." He was interrupted by Dr. Wu clearing his throat. "I believe," Dr. Wu said with a slight smile, "that we're witnessing the beginning of something important here. Sometimes it takes a crisis to spark real change." He gestured to his students. "Take note. This is how medicine evolves. Not just through new treatments, but through better understanding of our own human nature." As the morning continued, the room became a kind of impromptu classroom. Medical students took notes as both doctors shared their perspectives. Amy contributed insights from a nurse's point of view. Even Min chimed in occasionally, offering her experience as a patient. What had started as a terrible incident was transforming into something powerful, a moment of real learning and change. Through the window, they could see the city of Atlanta spreading out before them. And somehow, the future looked a little brighter than it had just 24 hours ago. The hospital boardroom was packed that afternoon. Extra chairs had been brought in to accommodate all the staff who wanted to attend. Nurses, doctors, and administrators sat shoulder to shoulder, while others stood along the walls. The story of what had happened in the emergency room had spread quickly through the hospital, and everyone seemed to sense that this meeting would be different from any other. Dr. Lee sat in the front row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Min was resting comfortably upstairs, with Amy keeping her company. Dr. Chen stood at the podium, looking smaller somehow without his usual confident demeanor. The board members watched him with serious expressions as he began to speak. "Yesterday, I failed as a doctor," he began, his voice shaking slightly. "I failed because I let personal bias overcome my professional judgment. I looked at a sick child and I saw everything except what I should have seen, a patient who needed my help." The room was completely silent. Even the usual hospital announcements over the intercom seemed muted. Dr. Chen continued, describing in detail how he had dismissed Min's symptoms, ignored her mother's medical expertise, and nearly caused a tragedy through his prejudiced behavior. "But I'm not here just to confess my mistakes," he said, straightening his shoulders. "I'm here to propose changes, real, concrete changes to make sure this never happens again." He gestured to Dr. Lee, inviting her to join him at the podium. Dr. Lee stood, her heart pounding. She hadn't prepared a speech, but as she looked at the faces around her, some friendly, some uncertain, all attentive, she knew exactly what needed to be said. "Yesterday could have ended in tragedy," she began, "not just for my daughter, but for Dr. Chen's daughter as well. Instead, it became a wake-up call. We have an opportunity here, not just to point fingers or assign blame, but to create meaningful change." Together, they presented their proposal: mandatory bias training for all staff, regular reviews of treatment decisions, anonymous reporting systems for patients and staff to flag concerns, and monthly meetings to discuss and learn from any incidents. Dr. Wu stood up from his seat among the board members. "I support this proposal," he said firmly, "but I think we need to go further. I propose we create a permanent committee to oversee these changes, with representatives from all departments, including nursing staff." He nodded toward Amy, who sat near the back. The hospital administrator, who had been listening intently, leaned forward. "This would require significant resources and commitment," she said. "But after hearing what happened, how can we not make these changes?" Voices began to rise from around the room. A resident spoke up about similar incidents she had witnessed but been afraid to report. A nurse shared stories of patients who had received different levels of care based on their backgrounds. The dam had broken, and years of unspoken experiences came pouring out. Dr. Chen listened to it all, the weight of his actions visible in his expression. But there was something else there too: determination. When the voices quieted, he spoke again. "I've been a doctor for many years," he said. "I thought I knew everything I needed to know. But yesterday taught me that being a good doctor isn't just about medical knowledge. It's about being a better human being. My daughter asked me this morning what I was going to do to make things right. Well, this is my answer. This is where we start. The board voted unanimously to approve the proposals. As people began to file out of the room, many stopped to share their own ideas or offer support. Dr. Lee felt a tap on her shoulder. It was Amy. "Min's asking for you," she said with a smile. "And she wants to know if she can have ice cream for dinner, since she's technically still a patient." The simple normalcy of the request brought tears to Dr. Lee's eyes. Up in that hospital room was her daughter, alive and well, asking for ice cream. And down here, in this boardroom, something powerful had begun, a change that would affect countless other patients in the years to come. Sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the best changes, if people were brave enough to learn from them. 2 weeks had passed since that life-changing day in the emergency room. The hospital corridors buzzed with a new kind of energy as changes began taking shape. Posters announcing the new bias training program covered bulletin boards, and sign-up sheets for the oversight committee filled up faster than anyone expected. Min had returned home days ago, her recovery progressing well. She sat on their living room couch, working on homework she'd missed, when the doorbell rang. Dr. Lee opened the door to find Dr. Chen standing there, holding a thick folder and looking nervous. "I hope I'm not interrupting," he said quietly. "I wanted to show you something before tomorrow's first committee meeting." He pulled out several documents from his folder. "These are the cases I've reviewed from the past year. Cases where my treatment might have been influenced by bias." Dr. Lee invited him in, and they sat at the kitchen table. Min looked up from her homework, curious, but not afraid. The girl who had been his patient that day was now becoming one of his greatest teachers. "I found patterns," Dr. Chen continued, spreading out the papers. "Times when I ordered fewer tests, spent less time with certain patients, made assumptions about their conditions." His hands trembled slightly as he pointed to specific cases. Each one of these could have been another tragedy. "But they weren't," Dr. Lee said gently. "And now you're doing something about it." The front door opened as they talked, and Dr. Chen's daughter walked in. She had also recovered well from her accident and had started joining her father in his mission to change the hospital's culture. She carried a laptop with a presentation she'd helped create for the new training program. "I interviewed some patients," she explained, opening her laptop. "Their stories, they're powerful. I think they'll help other doctors understand why these changes matter." Her voice held a mixture of pride and determination that made her father's eyes water. Amy had been busy too. She appeared at the house a few minutes later, carrying preliminary results from an anonymous staff survey she'd organized. The kitchen table became covered with papers, plans, and possibilities. "The nursing staff has so many insights," Amy explained, pointing to specific comments. "They see things doctors might miss, patterns of behavior that need to be addressed." She smiled at Min, who had wandered over to listen. Sometimes the best solutions come from seeing problems from all angles. They were interrupted by a call from Dr. Wu. He was excited to share news about other hospitals that had heard about their initiative and wanted to implement similar programs. What had started as one incident in one emergency room was spreading, creating ripples of change throughout the medical community. "We're calling it the Second Chance Protocol," Dr. Wu explained over speakerphone. "Because that's what this is really about, learning from our mistakes and doing better. Not just for ourselves, but for every patient who walks through our doors." Min, who had been quietly listening, suddenly spoke up. "Can I help too?" she asked. "Maybe I could talk to other kids who are scared of going to the hospital. Tell them things are changing." The adults in the room exchanged glances, moved by her desire to turn her difficult experience into something positive for others. Dr. Chen's daughter immediately opened a new document on her laptop. "That's a great idea," she said. "We could create a youth advisory board." As the afternoon sun streamed through the kitchen windows, the group continued planning and sharing ideas. The pain of that emergency room incident was still there, but it had transformed into something powerful, a force for real change. Dr. Lee watched them all. The doctor who had learned the hardest lesson of his career, the nurse who had dared to speak up, the teenagers who were helping shape a better future, and her own daughter, who had somehow emerged from a frightening experience with more courage than before. Sometimes the best healing happened not in hospital rooms, but in moments like these, when people came together, determined to learn from the past and create a better tomorrow. 3 months had passed since that fateful day in the emergency room. The hospital lobby was packed with reporters, cameras flashing as Dr. Lee and Dr. Chen stood together at the podium. Behind them, a large banner read, "Community Health Fair. Everyone deserves equal care." "When my daughter needed help, I failed as a doctor," Dr. Chen began, his voice clear and strong now, no longer weighed down by shame but lifted by purpose. But from that failure came an opportunity to create real change. Today, we're not just talking about what went wrong. We're showing you what we're doing to make it right. The crowd listened intently as they explained the changes implemented over the past months. The mandatory bias training program had already reached every department. Anonymous reporting systems were in place and actively used. Regular reviews of treatment decisions had revealed patterns that nobody had noticed before. Min and Dr. Chen's daughter sat in the front row, wearing matching t-shirts they'd designed for the youth advisory board they'd created. Around them, other young people who had joined their initiative nodded along, taking notes on their tablets for their next meeting. Amy stood nearby, surrounded by a group of nurses from different hospitals who had come to learn about the program. "It's not just about catching mistakes," she explained to them. "It's about creating an environment where everyone feels safe speaking up, where every patient knows they'll be heard." Dr. Wu stepped up to share the statistics. Emergency room wait times had become more equitable. Patient satisfaction scores had improved across all demographics. Other hospitals were reaching out weekly to learn about implementing similar programs. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," he said, gesturing to the back of the room, where dozens of former patients had gathered to share their experiences. "The real measure of our success is in the lives we touch, the trust we build, the community we serve." A small child ran up to Min, holding a drawing she'd made during the kids' activities at the health fair. Min smiled, remembering how scared she'd been in the hospital just a few months ago. Now here she was, helping other kids feel safer about getting medical care. Dr. Lee watched her daughter with pride, then turned back to the microphone. "Change doesn't happen overnight," she said. "It happens one conversation at a time, one decision at a time, one person at a time. What happened to my daughter was wrong, but look at what grew from that moment." She gestured to the lobby, where information booths lined the walls. Hospital staff from every department were engaging with community members, answering questions, breaking down barriers. Medical students conducted basic health screenings, taking time to explain everything they were doing. Dr. Chen's daughter had set up a special booth where young people could share their healthcare experiences and concerns. "We're not just planning for today," she explained to a reporter. "We're building the foundation for better healthcare in the future." As the formal presentation ended, people began mingling, sharing stories and ideas. An elderly gentleman approached Dr. Chen, tears in his eyes. "30 years I've been coming to this hospital," he said. "This is the first time I felt like I really belonged here." Outside, a local food truck had arrived to serve lunch to the health fair attendees. People sat at picnic tables, doctors next to patients, nurses beside community members, all talking and laughing together. The hospital, once just a building where people came when they were sick, was becoming a true center of community healing. Min and Dr. Chen's daughter had started making plans for the next youth advisory board meeting. "Maybe we could create a video," Min suggested, "showing kids what to expect when they come to the hospital." Her friend nodded enthusiastically, already pulling out her phone to take notes. As the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital grounds, Dr. Lee looked around at all they had accomplished. Sometimes the worst moments in life could lead to the most beautiful changes, if you were brave enough to learn, honest enough to change, and determined enough to make a difference. The real healing, she realized, wasn't just happening inside the hospital walls. It was happening in moments like these, when barriers came down and people came together, united in the simple belief that everyone deserved care, respect, and dignity. 1 year had passed. The hospital auditorium was filled to capacity for the first annual Healthcare Equality Conference. Doctors, nurses, and healthcare administrators from across the country had gathered to learn about what was now being called the Atlanta model of inclusive healthcare. Dr. Lee stood at the podium, looking out at the sea of faces. Next to her sat Min, now a confident teenager who had just finished sharing her story with the audience. In the front row, Dr. Chen beamed with pride. He had just received an award for his work in transforming hospital culture. "A year ago, I was a frightened mother watching my daughter suffer," Dr. Lee began. "Today, I stand before you as part of something much bigger than that one terrible morning. What happened to us could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it became a catalyst for change." She clicked to the next slide, showing statistics from the past year. Emergency room response times had equalized across all patient groups. Patient satisfaction scores had reached record highs. The anonymous reporting system had caught and corrected dozens of potential bias incidents before they could cause harm. "But numbers don't tell the whole story," she continued, gesturing to the back of the room. Amy stood up, along with several other nurses who had been instrumental in implementing the changes. "Real change happens because of people who care enough to speak up, to do better, to be better." Dr. Chen took the stage next, his daughter filming from the sidelines for their hospital's training program. "A year ago, I was the problem," he said honestly. "Today, I'm part of the solution. But more importantly, I'm proof that people can change when they open their hearts and minds." The Youth Advisory Board, which had grown from just 2 members to over 50, presented their latest initiative, a series of educational videos about healthcare rights and responsibilities, made by young people for young people. Min and Dr. Chen's daughter had become local celebrities of sorts, speaking at schools about the importance of advocating for proper medical care. "The most beautiful part," Dr. Wu added during the panel discussion, "is how this has spread beyond our hospital. We've helped 20 other hospitals implement similar programs. That's thousands of patients who will receive better care because of what we learned from one incident." During the lunch break, attendees crowded around various information booths in the lobby. Amy's nursing team demonstrated their new patient communication tools. Medical students showcased an app they developed to track treatment decisions for potential bias. Every corner of the hospital had found ways to contribute to the change. A surprise video message played from the hospital administrator who had approved the initial changes. She had since been promoted to oversee healthcare equality initiatives across the state. "What happened in our hospital that day was a wake-up call," she said, "but what's happened since then is nothing short of a revolution in healthcare." As the conference drew to a close, Min stood up once more. She was wearing a t-shirt that read, "Every patient matters," the slogan she and her fellow youth advisors had created. "A year ago, I was just a scared kid in the emergency room," she said. "Now I know that my voice matters. All our voices matter." Dr. Lee watched her daughter with tears in her eyes, remembering that terrifying morning that now felt like a lifetime ago. She thought about all the families who would never have to go through what they did, all the healthcare workers who were learning to recognize and overcome their biases, all the positive changes that had grown from that one dark moment. The conference ended with a commitment ceremony. Hundreds of healthcare professionals stood together, pledging to implement these changes in their own facilities. As they recited the words of the pledge, Dr. Lee caught Dr. Chen's eye across the room. They shared a smile, knowing that while they couldn't change the past, they had helped create a better future. Outside the auditorium, the hospital grounds were bustling with activity. New patients were being welcomed with respect and dignity. The emergency room was running smoothly, with every patient receiving equal attention. And somewhere in the building, another young person was getting the care they needed, regardless of who they were or where they came from. Sometimes the biggest changes start with the smallest moments. All it takes is the courage to learn from our mistakes, the wisdom to listen to each other, and the determination to make things better for everyone who comes after us.